But for the rest of us, we are going to walk through our new series looking at Nehemiah chapter 2. So we're in the we just started last week walking through the book of Nehemiah. And so if you have your Bibles, and I hope you do, would you turn to Nehemiah chapter 2? And as you're turning there, I wonder, have you ever felt the weight of a moment? I mean, have you ever been at a crossroads in life where your heart is pounding, your hands are shaking, you know that what you're about to say or do could change everything? You know, I remember the day I asked Emily to marry me. September 30th, 2016. I'd rehearsed every word, planned every detail, prepared for every possible scenario. I'd set the stage to make it seem like a normal date. I'd coordinated with the general manager of the movie theater to make sure nothing interfered. I'd told her dad, but not her mom, because I needed this to be a secret. I love you, Beth. I'd prayed that she would say yes. And really deep down, I knew that she would say yes. But when the moment finally came, right, ring in hand, knees shaking, palms sweaty, I realized the weight of that moment. That everything was leading to that one decision, that one question, that one moment that could change the rest of my life. And moments like that don't come often. They're sacred intersections where your preparation and your prayer and God's providence all meet in a single instant. And that's exactly where we find Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapter 2. For 4 months, he has prayed and fasted and waited. He's carried the burden of Jerusalem's ruins, their broken walls, and now he's standing before the most powerful man on earth at the time, and he finds himself in that weighty, defining moment, right, where one wrong word could cost him everything, where one act of faith could change the future of God's people. And what we discover in this passage is that when God's providence opens the door, faith must walk through it. So Nehemiah chapter 2, we're starting in verse 1. If you're with me, say word. Word. Let's get into it. It says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. Then I was very much afraid. And I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? And the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone? And when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. The first thing we need to see this morning, church, is that God's providence opens the door for restoration. God's providence opens the door for restoration. Again, for 4 months have passed between Nehemiah chapter 1, when he first heard that devastating report from Hanani about what was happening in Jerusalem, the state of its walls and the city. So from the month of Chislev to the month of Nisan, right, roughly from December to April, Nehemiah has waited and prayed and fasted and sought the Lord's direction. And what we ought to see is that those 120 days of silence were not wasted time, but this was sacred preparation. Providence often works in the time of waiting. And while Nehemiah prayed in Susa, God was already at work in the heart of King Artaxerxes. And what might have looked like delay at the time was actually divine arrangement. Again, verse 1 says, "It was in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him." If you're not familiar, Nisan was the first month of the Jewish religious calendar. Again, roughly March or April. But it also coincided with the Persian spring festival season. This was a time when the kings would celebrate renewal, when they would host lavish banquets, they would extend gestures of generosity. And so Nehemiah's opportunity, but with the king, comes at a very providential time, a time when the king's heart was already light, when his table was full, when his spirit was inclined towards kindness and generosity. Right? This is not coincidence. Right? This is divine providence. The same God who burdens Nehemiah's heart for Jerusalem now prepares King Artaxerxes' heart for mercy. Proverbs 21:1 reminds us the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. Even the emotions of a pagan ruler are instruments in the hands of our sovereign God. And Nehemiah, as the king's cupbearer, held a position of unique trust and influence with the king. His duty was not merely to serve the wine, but to guard the king's life. Right? He was to ensure that no poison reached the royal cup. And so to appear sad in this setting before the king was a dangerous proposition. In fact, Persian law considered it an offense to display sorrow in the royal presence, as it could be interpreted as disloyalty or dissatisfaction with the king's rule. And so the king's attendants were expected to reflect his joy, not his burdens. So when Nehemiah says in verse 1, "Now I had not been sad in his presence before," all right, this is not a throwaway remark. He's underscoring the risk of this moment. Right? His visible grief at what's happened in Jerusalem could cost him his position. It could even cost him his life. And yet this moment is precisely where God's providence begins to work. Right? It's in that tension between fear and faith. And after months of waiting, the Lord moves in an unexpected way through a question from a pagan king. And King Artaxerxes looks at Nehemiah in verse 2 and he says, "Why is your face sad? Why is your face sad? Right? You're not sick. This is nothing but sadness of the heart." And what's Nehemiah's response? Again, just knowing the context, he says, "Then I was very much afraid." Right? One wrong word here could end his career or his life. But in this moment of fear, God's timing collides with Nehemiah's burden that he's been praying for. And the door that Nehemiah was praying for in chapter 1 now swings wide open in chapter 2. And so Nehemiah responds in verse 3. He says, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" I want you to notice Nehemiah's tact here. He doesn't mention Jerusalem by name. Instead, what he does is he appeals to something the Persians held sacred, which was honor for one's ancestors. See, his heart is burdened for the city of God, but his language is wise towards the man of power. God's providence not only opens the door, but it also gives us discernment to know how to walk through it. And then he says in verse 4, "Then the king said to me, 'What are you requesting?' So I prayed to the God of heaven." I love that small little phrase there, right? I prayed to the God of heaven. It captures this heartbeat moment within the narrative, right? This heartbeat moment of dependence and faith where I'm sure you've had a moment right? A moment where you're in the midst of a crisis and you've just kind of said, "God, help me." Right? Lord, help me. And in the span of a breath, right, between the king's question and Nehemiah's reply, he lifts this silent, desperate prayer. Not a long prayer like we read in chapter 1, but just a short, reflexive prayer. But this is the tension in the story, right? It's the pregnant pause. The king has put him to the question, what exactly are you asking of me, O servant of mine? And Nehemiah is bold, and he says in verse 5, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. Nehemiah asked the king for permission to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. He says, if I have found favor. That word favor means grace. It's undeserved kindness. And you see, Nehemiah isn't relying on his skill or his position as the king's cupbearer, but he is asking for grace. Not just from the king, but ultimately from God. And I think it's important for us to remember here that this king, King Artaxerxes I, who he is going before now, this is the very same ruler who years earlier had given the decree commanding the Jews to stop rebuilding Jerusalem. Right? We see that in Ezra chapter 4. The king Artaxerxes was under pressure from Israel's enemies, and Artaxerxes, he gives this decree to halt the construction in Jerusalem because it was viewed as potentially rebellious. And so here, under the very same king, Nehemiah is asking him to reverse his decision. We should also consider the setting again where we're at. This is taking place in Susa, the royal citadel of Persia. But we should also note that this very same city, and likely this very same palace, is where Queen Esther once fasted and prayed before going before the king to risk her life on behalf of her people. You see, Esther's story takes place nearly 50 years earlier, and her husband, King Xerxes, was the father of King Artaxerxes, who Nehemiah now appears before. Do we see God's providence at work? In the same city, amongst the same royal lineage, God stirs the heart of a Persian king to preserve and restore his people. Esther stood before Artaxerxes' father, risking her life to intercede for Israel's survival. Now Nehemiah stands before the son, risking his life to intercede for Israel's restoration. Different servant, different generation, same God. The unseen hand that delivered Israel in Esther's day is the same hand that opens the door for restoration in Nehemiah's day. And what does it say the king does in verse 8? And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. The hand that once signed the order to stop the work now signs the order to start it again. What man had forbidden, God restores. Only providence can do that. Only the sovereign hand of God can overrule the hand of kings. Nehemiah says, that good hand of my God was upon me. That phrase, again, he's expressing the reality of this invisible sovereignty of God that is working through the visible actions of man. And Artaxerxes' throne may have been in Persia, but Nehemiah says the true authority belongs in heaven. So what's happening here? God is opening the door for restoration. The ruins of Jerusalem are about to rise, right? Not because of Nehemiah's influence, but because of God's initiative. The same God who turned the king's heart to save his people in Esther's day now turns the king's heart to restore his people in Nehemiah's. And when we look at this passage, we're reminded that the story of Nehemiah is not just about a city being rebuilt. It's about a God who still restores what sin has ruined. And the same God who moved in Susa's throne is still moving in the quiet details of our own lives. And so the first thing I want us to see as we look at application is this idea that God's delays are not his denials. Understand that God's delays are not his denials. For 4 long months, Nehemiah prayed and waited, and he had no visible answer. And yet all the while, God was preparing the heart of the king. He was preparing the timing of the request. He was preparing the provision for the journey. Church, God's providence often hides behind patience. God is never late. He's preparing you for the moment He's going to open the door. Sometimes the greatest evidence of God's faithfulness is not in the speed of His answer, but in the precision of His timing. And so if you find yourself in a season of waiting, take comfort. While you're waiting, God is working. His delays are not denials. Secondly, I want you to see that God can reverse what the world resists. Artaxerxes gave the order to stop the rebuilding, but now he is funding the very work that he had forbidden. Only God can do that. All right, that's the God who turns opposition into opportunity, who transforms resistance into restoration. Maybe there's an area of your life that feels permanently blocked, right? A relationship, a calling, a circumstance that feels beyond repair. Take heart. The same God who overruled the royal decree can overrule the verdict that seems final in your life. No human decision can undo divine purpose. 3, God's past faithfulness guarantees His present help. And think about the continuity of God's hand from Esther to Nehemiah. In the same city, with the same family, God moved again to preserve His people. And that's not coincidence. God is faithful from generation to generation. When you face new trials, remember old testimonies. The God who delivered you before has not forgotten how to deliver you again. What He was for Esther in her crisis, what He was for Nehemiah in his, what He was for all of them throughout the Old Testament, the New Testament, He still is for you. He has not changed. You can trust Him. 4, God opens doors we could never force open. See, Nehemiah didn't try to manipulate the situation or push his way forward with his position or his influence. He prayed, he waited, and he trusted. And at the right moment, God opened the door through the eyes of the pagan king. Church, you don't have to force open what God has already appointed. Your role is to stay faithful in the waiting, ready when the door swings wide to walk through it. And when we do that, we walk through it like Nehemiah, prayerfully, but we walk through it with faithful obedience. 5th, God's providence is the beginning of your restoration. See, before the first stone was laid down to repair Jerusalem, God was already laying the foundation for renewal in Persia. He was already working within Nehemiah's heart. And that's how restoration always begins. It's not in our own striving, but it's in God's sovereign hand. Your healing, your renewal, your rebuilding will not begin in your own power, but in God's. And maybe this morning you're here and you're saying, you know what, my heart is in ruins. My life feels a wreck. Maybe your faith feels fractured. But God's hand still can open the door for restoration, not just from your circumstances, but of your soul. He is the God who takes what is broken and begins to rebuild. God's providence opens the door for restoration. But secondly, church, God's wisdom guides the work of restoration. His providence opens the door, but His wisdom guides the work. Look at verse 9. It says, "And I came to the governors of the province beyond the river, and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, and a few men with me. And I told no one what God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me, but the one on which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gates, into the dragon spring, and to the dung gates, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down, and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate, and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley, and inspected the wall. And I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. And I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. See, verse 9 here, it tells us that he had received the governors of the province beyond the river, and that he had gave them the letters the king sent him. And this phrase, beyond the river, here is important. It refers to the region west of the Euphrates, essentially the entire area that included Judah and Jerusalem. These letters of authority were given to him from King Artaxerxes. And so they would have given Nehemiah legal permission to pass through the Persian provinces to go on to begin his reconstruction of Jerusalem. But we should see something significant here, which is that Nehemiah is not traveling alone. He is arriving escorted by Persian officers and cavalry, which that alone is an unmistakable sign of royal favor. And this is both a practical protection for Nehemiah, but it's also providential confirmation that God's hand is still on him. But it's interesting that Nehemiah, knowing that God is with him, still seeks to act wisely. You see, he doesn't presume upon God's favor, but he walks prudently under it. He accepts the protection that's been granted to him. And there's also a contrast here. If you were to go back and read the book of Ezra, Ezra makes a similar journey to Jerusalem, but Ezra actually denies the escort. Ezra is offered an armed escort, but he denies it because he wants to demonstrate his trust in God's protection. But Nehemiah, in contrast, accepts the escort, not because he's afraid, but because his mission was both political and spiritual. And what we see is that wisdom does not look the same in every circumstance. True wisdom discerns what obedience looks like in the moment that God provides. Verse 10 says, "But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel." And this is really where the tension in the story begins to build. You see, we know that Nehemiah was grieved by the news of Jerusalem. He wept and he prayed and he fasted. And then we had the tension of him addressing the king and what's the king going to say. And then there's the falling action of, yes, the resolution, the king accepts his request. And now he's on a mission and he's going out to Jerusalem to rebuild. And as he's going, we're introduced to two new characters. These two men would become the chief antagonists throughout the rest of the book. And what we should note is that their opposition is not just incidental, it's inherited. See, Sanballat the Horonite was likely the governor of Samaria, the region north of Judah. And the title Horonite most likely refers to his origin coming from the city of Beth Horon, which is in Ephraim, west of Jerusalem. But that region has a long and complicated history with the people of Israel. You see, in Genesis 14:10, the Horonites appear as a part of the land that was once occupied by the Canaanites. But in Deuteronomy 2:12, we learn that they were displaced by the descendants of Esau. I don't think they went willingly. Sanballat also would have been representative of this syncretic, half-pagan community of Samaria. These people who have blended Judaism with idol worship. And these people opposed the restoration of true and pure worship of God in Jerusalem because it threatened both their political control and their religious compromise. And so Sanballat here really stands as a picture of both religious opposition and political interest. And then you have Tobiah the Ammonite. The Ammonites trace their lineage back to Genesis 19:36 through 38 through Lot's incestuous relationship with his younger daughter. And from their earliest days, the Ammonites were a people hostile to Israel. I mean, when Israel journeyed toward the promised land, it was the Ammonites who refused them passage. It was the Ammonites who continually fought against them. And so in Judges 10 through 12, we see God raised up Jephthah to defeat the Ammonites. In 1 Samuel 11, King Saul fights against the Ammonites. In 2 Samuel 10, King David conquers the Ammonites. In Deuteronomy 23, it says, "No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord even to the 10th generation." There is a history of hostility, both political, spiritual. They stood in opposition to the promises and the covenants of God. So when Nehemiah arrives to seek the welfare of Israel, it's no wonder that Sanballat and Tobiah are greatly displeased. In fact, the Hebrew text literally says, when they heard this, it was evil to them, a great evil. What God calls good, they call evil. The restoration of Jerusalem represents the return of God's blessing, and that's precisely what the enemies of God have always opposed. So their displeasure exposes a deeper problem, that they are not just against Nehemiah, but they are against God's redemptive plan. Nehemiah, however, responds with wisdom and restraint. He doesn't react emotionally. He doesn't confront them prematurely. He doesn't start public arguments or expose his plans. He exercises the same kind of discernment that Jesus would teach his disciples in Matthew 10:16. Be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. There's a time to confront and a time to be silent, and wisdom knows the difference. And then in verse 11, we see a shift in the narrative here. Nehemiah says, "So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days." Again, after being in Persia and the city of Susa, we have now gone to Jerusalem, a 1,000-mile journey, a trip that would have taken him nearly 2 months to complete. Nehemiah finally arrives, but rather than making this grand entrance or immediately rallying the people to his cause, he waits. Right? For 3 days, he's quiet. No announcements, no strategies, no speeches. And verse 12 says, "Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem." Again, this verse shows us Nehemiah's spiritual sensitivity. Right? Who does he give credit to for this mission? This is not about personal ambition for him, but this is divine initiative. He says, "This is what God had put into my heart." And after waiting these 3 days, what does he do? He chooses to survey the city at night. And when no one can see him, right? He didn't want to be seen. He's keeping a low profile. So in verse 13, we read, "I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring, to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down, and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall. And I turned back and entered the valley gate, and so returned." See, Nehemiah tells us that he left the city by night through the valley gate. He made his way to the dragon spring, to the dung gate, to the fountain gate. Then he went back the same way. And we don't have an exact map that Scripture gives us of the city. But the best that we can know from early reports of ancient Jerusalem, these gates were likely located along the southern edge of the city. They would have been overlooking the Himnon and the Kidron Valley. And this was the area that was most exposed to enemy attack. It was the area that was most likely suffered the most severe damage during the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah moves carefully and quietly through the rubble. And he's observing by the light of the moon. That word, he says, "I inspected." It means to look closely, to examine carefully. All right, he's not taking a passing glance. He's giving a deliberate assessment. And what we see is that wisdom acts this way. Before Nehemiah begins to rebuild, he first takes time to understand the full scope of what's been broken. He doesn't rely upon flawed reports or assumptions. He wants to see the devastation for himself. And when the damage becomes too severe for even his animal to continue, he turns back the way he came and re-enters the city. And he hasn't even made a full circuit of Jerusalem, but he's seen enough to grasp both the magnitude of the task and the faithfulness of the God who's called him to it. In verse 16, he says, "And the officials did not know where I'd gone or what I was doing. And I had not told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work." Nehemiah exercises restraint. Again, he does not go about announcing his plans. He waits for the right time when both the vision and the people are ready. That's spiritual discernment. The ability to recognize that God's work must be done in God's way and in God's time. And Proverbs 16:3 reminds us as well, commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. Nehemiah has committed every step of this process to the Lord. His wisdom is not worldly shrewdness, it is dependent discernment. He not only plans carefully, but he plans prayerfully. He's not driven by impulse or fear, but he is guided by the quiet assurance that the God who opened the door in Persia is now guiding the work in Jerusalem. So before he rebuilds the walls, God is shaping the worker. He is forming in Nehemiah a heart that is steady and discerning and fully dependent on him. What I think we can see here, church, is that wisdom isn't just knowing when to wait. It's knowing how to walk once God says go. Right? When God opens a door, walk through it with discernment. Not every opportunity requires speed. Some require strategy. Nehemiah teaches us that faith doesn't cancel carefulness, it compels it. And as you follow God's leading, learn to see before you speak. Learn to understand before you act. Don't build plans on emotion or assumption. Seek clarity. Gather facts. Pray and ask God for insight. And as you do that, keep your plans humble and flexible. Nehemiah inspected the walls before announcing the mission. Likely, godly wisdom listens before it leads. Be sensitive to how God may adjust your direction as you go. And lead privately before leading publicly. Before Nehemiah cast his vision, he confirmed his conviction. In the same way, church, let your private obedience prepare you for public influence. And through it all, trust the God who orders your steps, the one who opens the door. He's in control. We see this morning that God's providence opens the door for restoration. His wisdom guides the work for restoration. And lastly, church, God's power strengthens us to endure opposition to restoration. Look at verse 17. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. After surveying the walls, Nehemiah gathers the people and he finally speaks to them. Right? This is his speech. And he says in verse 17, again, you see the trouble we're in. You see how Jerusalem lies in ruins. Come, let us build the wall. This is a turning point in Nehemiah's leadership. Again, up to this point, he has prayed in private. He has planned in secret. He's spoken only to God and the king. But now he addresses the people of God for the first time. The burden that began in the palace has now become public calls to action in Jerusalem. And look at his approach, right? Nehemiah doesn't command the people. He identifies himself with them. He says, you see the trouble we are in, right? He's sharing their shame, not as some outsider with royal authority, but as a brother with empathy. God's power gives him both courage and compassion. And the people of Jerusalem, who had lived in discouragement for generations, their city in ruins, their identity as God's people mocked. But then when Nehemiah speaks, something shifts. Right? The tone and the clouds of despair begin to give way. Why? Because Nehemiah doesn't appeal to human ability. He points to divine activity. Verse 18, he says, and I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words the king had spoken to me. Nehemiah grounds his appeal for the labor in God's power at work. The hand of God is the recurring phrase throughout Ezra and Nehemiah that symbolizes this divine empowerment. It was God's hand that moved King Artaxerxes to grant permission. It was God's hand that guided Nehemiah's journey. And it's God's hand now at work strengthening the people. And what's the result? The people said, let us get up. Let us arise and build. So they strengthened their hands for the work. Again, what we're seeing here is not just emotional excitement. This is revival. This is a spirit-empowered resolve amongst God's people. It says that they strengthened their hands. This is a Hebrew idiom which means determination and readiness. The people's hearts, which once were fearful and faint, disgraced in shame, they are now firm in faith. When God's power moves, God's people move. But where God's work advances, the enemy also advances. In verse 19, we have the drama comes back. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab, new character, when they heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Again, what we see here is opposition arises from every direction. Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, would have been in the north. Tobiah the Ammonite from the east. Geshem the Arab would have represented the tribes of the south. And so collectively they form a ring of hostility around Jerusalem. God's people are quite literally surrounded by their enemies. The same pattern repeats throughout redemptive history. Whenever God's work advances, opposition comes from every side. And what do these enemies say? Are you rebelling against the king? This is not an honest question. This is a deliberate attempt to instill fear and suspicion in the work. These words echo the same accusations that the group in Ezra faced in Ezra chapter 4. It's the enemy's oldest tactic. If he can't stop the work through force, he'll try to stop it through fear. But Nehemiah doesn't waver for a moment. Look at verse 20. Then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we are his servants. We, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no portion or rights or claim in Jerusalem. Again, notice where his confidence lies, not in the royal approval and documents that he's been sent with, not in his own influence and human strength, but in divine authority. The God of heaven will make us prosper. His courage is not self-confidence, it's God confidence. Nehemiah knows that the one who called him to the work is powerful enough to complete it. And so he finishes with a declaration of covenant identity. He says to his enemies, you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. And all three of those words are covenant terms tied to inheritance. Nehemiah reminds their enemies that they are outsiders to God's promises. The work of God belongs to the people of God, empowered by the Spirit of God, protected by the power of God. So when the enemies mock, Nehemiah stands. When they accuse, he answers with truth. And when they threaten, he trusts in the unshakable strength of his sovereign God. God's power doesn't always remove the opposition, church, but it always enables his people to stand firm in the face of it. So when you step out in obedience, don't be surprised when opposition steps in. The enemy doesn't bother those who are comfortable living in apathy. He attacks those who are advancing in faith. Like Nehemiah, you may find that obedience brings mockery or misunderstanding or accusation, but here's the truth for you. The same God who opened the door and guides your steps will also strengthen your heart. So when ridicule comes, stand firm in God's power, not your own resolve. The world may question your motives or distort your message, but God's servants are sustained by his Spirit, not human approval. When fear whispers, remember whose hand is upon you. Nehemiah didn't answer his critics with clever arguments, but with quiet confidence. The God of heaven will make us prosper. You don't have to fight every battle. You just have to stay faithful. When enemies surround you, keep your eyes on the one who surrounds everything. The God who strengthened Nehemiah is the same God who strengthens his people today. So when resistance comes, and it will, don't retreat. like the people, rise up and build. God will power. He will sustain. His providence will continue. You know, in 1563, there was a man named John Fox who wrote a book you might have heard of. It's called Fox's Book of Martyrs. And in it, he tells the story of Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer, two English pastors who were condemned to burn at the stake for preaching the gospel during bloody Queen Mary's reign. And as the flames were lit beneath them, Latimer turned to Ridley and he said, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall see this day, we shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." They stood firm, not because they were fearless, but because they trusted the God who was faithful. The fire that was meant to destroy them only made their witness shine brighter. And that's what Nehemiah models. That's what Christ fulfills. God's power doesn't always remove the fire, but it strengthens his people to stand up in it. Church, Nehemiah's story reminds us that God's work will always draw the world's resistance. The wall he rebuilt would one day crumble again. But the God who strengthened him is still building something that cannot fall today. He's still building a kingdom of living stones, of redeemed hearts, of eternal hope. Like Nehemiah, we are called to rise up and build. But before we can build for God, we must first be rebuilt by God. You see, our sin has left us in ruins, walls broken, hearts exposed, lives ashamed. Yet Christ came to do what no man could do, to restore what sin had destroyed. And so where Nehemiah left the comfort of the palace to rebuild Jerusalem's walls, Jesus left the glory of heaven to rebuild our relationship with the Father. Where Nehemiah faced mockers at the wall, Jesus faced mockers at the cross. And through his death and resurrection, he did not just restore a city, he redeemed a people. The same God who gave Nehemiah strength to stand against opposition now offers grace to all who will turn from sin and trust in Jesus. The God who rebuilt the ruins of Jerusalem can rebuild the ruins of your life. So today, if you feel broken this morning, if you feel distant, if you feel far from God, hear his call. Come, let us rise and build. But don't start with your hands, start with your heart. Repent and believe, and let the master builder restore you from the inside out. Because the God of heaven still makes his servants prosper, and the work he begins, he always finishes. Would you pray with me?